Welcome to Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Claire O'Connor, Administrative Assistant at Kingston Writers Fest. It's actually supposed to be Era hosting this event, but unfortunately she can't make it, so I'm filling in. And I am pleased to present event number 12, the Robertson Davies Lecture. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the festival customarily takes place and where I stand tonight is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peacefully share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All of those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We hope you followed the sponsorship acknowledgement video that was playing before the event started. I'd like to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to these organizations and individuals who support the festival. Kingston Writers Fest would especially like to thank Jennifer Surridge, event sponsor of this event, Karen Charlton and Mike Scrannage, author patrons of Bill Richardson. This event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any point during the event for the moderator. You'll find the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and there is also a raise your hand function located in reactions, generally located in the bottom row, depending on your device, or you can press *9 to raise your hand if you are joining us via phone, and we will prompt you to unmute when it is your turn. As a thank you for continuing to support Kingston Writers Fest and joining us for the virtual edition, we will randomly select a pre-registered participant of this event following our Q&A. We will do this for each onstage event throughout the festival. Now, I am delighted to introduce this event's moderator, Bill Richardson. Bill Richardson is an award-winning and prolific creator of witty prose, children's books, poetry, and a bit of everything else in between. With a wide knowledge of arcane and entertaining subjects, Bill can talk to anyone in any situation, and he peppers his conversation with fascinating nuggets of information. A well-known personality on CBC Radio, he lent his voice to various programs, including Richardson's Roundup, Saturday Afternoon at the Opera, and moderated 5 seasons of Canada Reads. Bill is no stranger to the Kingston Writers Fest stage as MC of the Saturday night Speakeasy and as an interviewer to some of Kenlet's biggest names, including Jane Urquhart, Emily St. John Mandel, Stephen Price, and Elizabeth Hay. Please welcome Bill Richardson.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here in this virtual kind of way. I'm in Winnipeg right now, Treaty 1 territory, and it's such an honor. And I know it's going to be such a pleasure to have this chance to talk to Camilla Gibb. Hey, Camilla.
Hi, Bill. Thank you. It's so nice to be here with you too. One of my favorite broadcasters. I feel like I should close my eyes and just listen to you.
Thank you for saying so. That was all a long, long time ago. I appreciate the kindness of Claire's introduction, and also the kindness of Karen and Mike, who sponsored my participation, and Jennifer Surridge, who's the event sponsor for this Robertson Davies Lecture. I'm kind of assuming, Camilla, that people who are tuned in know who you are, but not to shortchange you on an introduction. So Camilla is the author of, Mouthing the Words and The Petty Details of So-and-so's Life, and Sweetness in the Belly, and This Is Happy, and I'm going to forget something. Most recently, the Beauty of Humanity movement, and most recently, the book where finally it gets to it, The Relatives, her most recent novel, which has been published by Doubleday Canada, and is a wonderful read. We spoke on the phone a couple of days ago, and I didn't talk to you then, Camilla. I'll say it now. I don't know if you remember that back in 2001, so brief pause to do the math, 20 years ago, I was a judge for the CBC literary competition.
Oh, wow.
And that there was this story that came before us, Between Wars.
That's right.
The story. Mm-hmm. And these are blind judgings. Nobody knows who the writer. The jury doesn't know who the writer is. And in fact, I can't actually remember who my fellow jurors were a long time ago. But I remember we were sitting in the house where I was living at the time, and unmasked, because in those days you didn't need one. And we came to a very quick unanimous decision on that story. It was, and when I found out who had written it, I thought, oh, of course, why didn't I know? Because it was so full of the stuff that suffuses all your writing, a kind of a global vision, which is broad and sophisticated and informed, and a more compact and condensed, but no less fascinating interest in relationship. And those are earmarks of the relatives as well, I would say. And I'm going to stop yammering very, very soon, I promise. I'm mindful that I'm begging on. This is actually not about me. But a few months ago in the New York Times Book Review, and this ties us to this being the Robertson Davies Lecture, the American politician, voting rights activist, gubernatorial candidate in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, was interviewed because she's published a new book. And one of the questions she was asked, this is in the New York Times, in their sort of bedside book column. One of the questions she was asked is, what's the book that you like to tell people about that you think they might not have heard about? I'm paraphrasing the question. And she answered, well, Robertson Davies, What's Bred in the Bone? That was, which is the second volume of the Cornish trilogy, a great novel. And I think there was this big sort of flurry of commentary about Robertson Davies just then. And I bring this up only because the title of that book, What's Bred in the Bone, is so germane in a way to the relatives, which is a novel essentially about family making. So we'll have more to say about that. You'll have more to say about that. I'll try to say about it as much as I can, having gone on too long already. But maybe, Camilla, the best thing to do would be to begin with a reading, just from the beginning of the book, and just set it up as you would like.
So this book has 3 related stories. I use that word deliberately. But I suppose in some ways it's more the job of the writer to figure out those relationships. But I will just introduce you to the first character we encounter, Lila. Jackie presses a manila file into my hands for the 3rd time in 4 months. The label is simply marked Robin. I know she thinks it will do me good to take the case on, but she also knows me well enough not to say it. We've been working together now for more than a decade. I interned here during my social work training, and 2 years later, after my first job ended in disaster, Jackie offered me an opportunity to redeem myself under her supervision. She's a mentor and a friend. I was even maid of honor at her wedding to Solomon, a second one for each of them last year. I slap the folder against my palm and smile. Jackie knows I've run out of excuses. Robin was referred to us in the spring by the Children's Aid Society, the way most children come into our services. Our team health assessment and treatment in cases where the police are involved. This case is a particular mystery. In April, the police found a girl wandering in her pajamas in Hyde Park. A dental exam suggested she was about 11. She didn't speak then and hasn't spoken in the 5 months since. No one has reported her missing or come forward to claim her. When Jackie first came to me with Robin's case, I was working with a young man who, after several months in a methadone program, had decided to lay charges against his former hockey coach. I knew he would need a lot of additional support once he went public with his story, and I insisted I couldn't take on another case when I needed to be available not only to him, but to any other former players who might come forward as a consequence. While this was true, and while I've seen many disturbing things over the years, what is even truer is that my reluctance to work with children has almost developed into an aversion. I put Robin's file into my briefcase and take a cab home at the end of the day. The prospect of leaving the evidence of someone's trauma on a bus, just too sad. As I climb the fire escape at the back of my building, a train shudders by on the elevated track 20 feet behind me. I need to move, I say to myself, as I say to myself almost every day. I'm not supposed to be almost 40, single and living in this shitty apartment. It was a temporary move, a way of extricating myself quickly from Michael, but I've been here now for almost 2 years. I plant myself on the couch and pull Robin's file out of my briefcase. The first picture I come across was taken on May 16th. Just her face, gray eyes looking away from the camera, chin jutting out. Her hair is an indeterminate brown halo. Her skin is so pale it's almost translucent, like egg white. The initial medical report identifies rickets as the likely cause of the bowing of her lower legs. She's being treated for vitamin D deficiency, giardia, pinworm, and anemia. The rest of the report reads like an autopsy. No semen in her vagina, no saliva other than her own. A list of fibers found on her body, including bark, hay, and bird feathers, and a note about traces of raccoon feces found in her hair. In a photo taken this summer, Robin's hair is brushed and trimmed and pulled back in a ponytail. She's wearing a white shirt. She gazes away from the camera, same gray eyes and translucent skin. Her chin softer this time, but the overall effect still haunting. I put down the file and walked to the front window to pull the curtains closed. It started to rain. Smokers huddle under the awning of the bar across the street. If they were to look up, they'd see me in outline, a black shape at a third-story window, a woman without a face. There's a photo among my mother's things, one I wish she'd never kept, of the girl they adopted in 1975. The defiance in the girl's face is painful, a futile attempt to deny her vulnerability. She's only 3 years old. Whatever memories she had then would be lost, at least consciously, to later experiences. It would be the unconscious that would haunt her. The part that worries me about Robin is that her photos evoke a feeling of recognition. It's as if I'm looking at the ghost who lives in me. That's where I'll stop.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Lila, as a social worker, Robin is the case, as we've just heard that she's taking on. And Lila in the novel joins, although doesn't meet because there are 3 separate stories, but related, as you said, Tess. And both Lila and Tess's stories are told in the first person. I think I wrote about that.
Yes.
And Adam, who's told in the third. They are all connected in ways that they can't really suspect, and maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. But let's just talk a little bit more about Lila, having heard this about her. And one of the, reading through your books, I've noticed that you have a real kind of fascination with what I think we could broadly call the helping professions. Social work. Social workers come up quite a lot in your writing, or
you're right, and doctors and nurses,
psychiatrists, yeah, therapists.
It's true.
What's okay, Camilla? What's that about?
No one's ever asked me that, Bill. I might need to lie down to tell you. That's a really good question. I think there's this kind of, I think it's a preoccupation. It's a writerly preoccupation. I mean, what are we trying to do? We're examining people. We're examining something about the human condition.
Yeah.
And we're trying to probe. We're trying to get inside. And you write, hopefully, when one finds a connection to a character, you're kind of writing from the inside out. And then, often my characters run into a bit of well, emotional trouble would be putting it mildly. Struggle with their own mental health issues.
Yeah.
Often, which brings them into the realm of psychiatry and other, I guess, modalities of treatment. And I think what's shared there is this desire, shared by the writer and shared by perhaps the health practitioner, whether it's physical or mental. I mean, we can't really separate them quite so cleanly. Is this kind of desire to figure out the problems of being human,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Right.
But I had actually never noticed, which is really interesting.
This is why you have readers, right?
That's true. Yes.
It's actually not, it is not your work as a writer to notice that kind of thing. It's
not
just,
my job.
Yeah. It's the job of the reader to flag these kinds of things, these themes that come up over the course of a person's writing, and not necessarily to raise them in public. Sadly, I mean, we both agree. We've contracted ourselves to be in this situation where I get to ask you that kind of dumbass question. So there you go.
What's interesting, Bill, is you're right. There aren't that many opportunities, I think, when you get to sort of to look at your work objectively, right? For the writer to look at their work objectively. And I think especially early on in a career, you don't necessarily see the kind of common themes or common problems that you're trying to work out.
Yeah.
And then you become aware at some point that you're probably writing the same book. You're probably writing the same book in some ways, or at least mining the same problem or pursuing the same question in an entirely different, through an entirely different framework, through the lives of different others, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is also just the business of fiction. It's what we do when we tell stories. We focus in, of necessity, on the remarkable, because nobody wants to read 400 pages about a family that lives happily together with no conflict and watches Netflix 3 nights a week without even fighting over the show. I mean, we focus in on situations that are in extremis because it's about drama in the end, and that's where the drama lies. But it is again, a lot of your writing is family based. That can be said of many writers, that can be said of many books. But this is maybe a fatuous question. That would be novel for me to ask. But I'm going to ask it anyway. It's a broad one, and it's about why do we have as writers? I shouldn't say we, because that's not really what I do. But writers have this deep and lingering fascination with family. Is it just because it's so charged?
I think often, who was it? I don't know if it was, I can't remember who it was, Bill. I'm reaching a certain age myself where things, I should probably make notes that I stick beside the door. Somebody said, number one, when a writer is born into a family is finished.
Uh-huh.
But somebody else said, when, you know, give me a troubled childhood and I will give you a writer.
Uh-huh.
You know, you have enough material to last for the rest of your life. And I think because we are probing these questions about, you know, what is it to be human and to navigate our way through the world and what constitutes our identities. You know, family, of course, is, you know, is kind of where the trouble starts, I suppose. And then I'm interested in kind of notions of belonging, whether it's in the context of belonging and becoming, I guess, and whether it's in the context of a family or a broader community, a religious community, whatever defines the community as a whole. And how do we move from outsider to insider status? You know, and is that even achievable? Is it even desirable sometimes? And I think writers so often are kind of positioned on the outside. It's a slightly discomforting position, right? You're kind of positioned between out and in. You sort of have a foot in either world. You're kind of straddling this subject objective kind of experience. And so you're making observations about the people closest to you, much to their horror sometimes.
No
and
doubt.
you're making use of that material because you're trying to figure out these big questions, I think, about meaning and belonging.
I have not read deeply in the sociology of the professions, but it does seem to me, looking again back to the helping professions, the ones that we talked about, social work, psychiatric social work or clinical social work, therapy, psychiatry, that somebody making a decision to go into those professions is making a decision that is not dissimilar from that made by somebody who decides to go into becoming a writer. The fodder for the work is the human condition and the human story.
Yeah, and the human story, as you just what you said about, how do we construct a narrative of our lives that makes our lives intelligible, and comprehensible and shareable as well.
The Relatives is a book about the creation of family, and the creation of family in very contemporary ways. And I'll get you to talk about that in just a moment. But do you think that is the created family, the contemporary family, the chosen family in some ways, is a different beast from what, well, if I call it the traditional family, maybe people will understand what I mean. I think I mean the kind of family in which I grew up.
In the heteronormative, genetically.
Everybody together at dinner time, that sort of thing.
Sure.
A classic post-war sort of family it became very much a sort of norm. Didn't last long, but I wonder if the contemporary family, the created family, for all of its manufacture in a way, is any less prey to the difficulties and the pressures that have been so famously described in so many stories and so many novels about the traditional family.
I mean, there might be different issues, but there will always be issues. There's always a fundamental conflict, I think, between how do you hold together as a unit and kind of have, how do you achieve sort of goals or wants or desires that are shared versus how does the individual, to what extent do we subsume our individual needs and desires for the sake of this entity that we call a family? And I think there's a kind of constant tension between those things. I think there's an ebb and flow between those things. I don't have a more romantic view of I mean, the chosen family certainly puts a good positive spin on it. But, in this case, I have families that are differently constructed. In one case, I have a single mother. In one case, I have a lesbian couple who have used, they've conceived through IVF using one of the women's eggs and donor sperm.
So it's just in vitro fertilization,
Yes, in vitro fertilization. In another case, we have a sperm donor who later in life, he donated as a young man, really, to pay his way through graduate school, has never really given much thought to the idea of, has no desire to be a parent himself, but of course, later in life, he's with a woman who would like to have his child. So there are these different, and there are tensions that arise in every case, like how do we achieve the family we desire? And then what takes place within those families? I mean, for Tess and Emily in particular, the two women who have a son, they've frozen a number of embryos. So there's this genetic material that is frozen sitting in a freezer in Atlanta. And when they split up, it becomes a question of, who owns these things and who has the right to do what with these things? Is it property, in the way of other marital assets to be divided? Like, where does it fall in it, both ethically and legally and emotionally?
Yeah.
Where does it land?
I love that you grapple with these kinds of questions. I can well imagine how you might very well have taken the legal route yourself. You probably would have made one heck of a good lawyer. But again, we spoke about this when we chatted on the phone the other day, but in Mouthing the Words, there's a moment when the character Thelma, I mean, Mouthing the Words is that sort of an impossible thing, a really raucous novel, a funny novel that deals in large measure with sexual abuse. I mean, it sounds so incompatible, but it was your first novel, and that you were able to do that is astonishing. But Thelma has this moment where she's talking to her advisor, the dean of the law school. She's attending the law school, and she's top of her class, and she can't believe it, and she's asking the dean to weigh in on her question, which is, if one of my other personalities was actually responsible for this, I still do the work. And it's a little more quizzical and quixotic, I guess, but and less kind of anchored in reality than the question of who owns the frozen embryos. But it's not in its own way a dissimilar kind of thing, because I mean, 25 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, nobody would ever have imagined that this would exist as a legal quandary, that this would be something that lawyers and that parents would have to wrestle with. It's extraordinary how much things have changed.
Well, yes, and it's very much a kind of, I mean, I will get to that idea of the parallel that you see, but it's a really rapidly evolving kind of area of law. The law hasn't quite caught up to well, there are two. On the one hand, the law hasn't quite caught up to the kind of all the manifestations that may be possible through uses of reproductive technology, for instance. But then on the other hand, to what extent do we want to invite the law into such intimate terrain?
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe that's more of a philosophical than a pragmatic question. But it just occurs to me, Bella, when you draw that kind of comparison, that I have lawyers in more than one book, as well as medical people. And maybe, I mean, it's an interesting observation, because maybe I like people to have jobs. I don't know. You know how often characters, many characters historically didn't seem to have friends or jobs. But you know, you want to situate them in terms of what they do in the day-to-day and who they know and who they see.
Yeah. I'm not gonna lose track of what you were just saying, but just it occurs to me now that when you name your characters, so again, just we've got Tess and Emily, they're the lesbian couple who have had the in vitro fertilization. Adam, about whom we haven't spoken much, but we'll get to him, and Lila, the social worker from you read her the beginning of the book. Do you wrestle with the naming of your characters, or do you just kind of do it arbitrarily? Is it?
You know, it's a good question. I think when I truly know them, whether it's the name seems, it's got to feel right. Yeah. And I didn't really know Tess and Emily for quite some time, and Lila's name changed too. I didn't know them well enough. I kind of write my way to knowing who people are and who characters are. And then it's kind of only at that point that I can give them a name that feels absolutely kind of authentic to who they are. But there have been other characters who I've named, you know, I've known the name from the start, Thelma, Mouthing the Words. I knew that I wanted something kind of anachronistic, you know, out of step, out of time.
Right.
In her case. And I knew that from the start. Adam, I knew from the start, and he's probably the character I care most about, actually. And I feel I know him best in some ways, even though he's quite unknowable.
Well, he's also very aptly named, being Adam, the first man, the first father, and in fact, it's also, I mean, he has a pseudonym attached to him as well.
Yes, yes, and he has had more than one in his lifetime of sort of covert operations in East Africa. Yeah. And work for the Foreign Service.
Okay, so let's talk about Adam, and we'll come back to Tess and Emily, because I think in some ways their story is, well, I think you've spoken about this quite publicly, so it's central to your own life too as well. So Adam is this guy who works. He's, well, you wrote him. You talk about him. Who's Adam?
You've read it more recently.
Well, he's sort of an aid worker, but he's sort of not. He occupies a shady realm, and
he's often sort of parachuted into situations where the U.S. Foreign Service is involved or has an interest, to kind of, he's not security exactly, but he's sort of intelligence. He does intelligence work. He's trying to find out, what's happening in a particular location.
In the time that you spent in Ethiopia and in different places you've been in the Middle East, you must have come across a lot of people who were there working with different aid agencies. Were you aware of that kind of shady intersection that some of them may have?
I didn't have a whole lot of exposure to people who worked for aid agencies. I had more exposure to expats who worked for companies with commercial interests, and some of which was probably shady. But no, in this case with I don't even know how I came up with Adam's work, to be perfectly honest. I cannot remember. I think I had a sense of who he was and where he would be, and he is kidnapped. So we're leading up to the kidnapping when we first meet him. However, I think I had to do the research later to figure out, well, what would he have been doing there in any case? And yeah, I can't say I've ever met. Maybe it's less about his job. I have met people like Adam, but it's less his job than it is a kind of a restless sort of spirit that would be probably uncomfortable at home.
Right.
And probably doesn't really belong anywhere, and is a bit of a wild card, and has, in Adam's case, has very little sort of attachment, either to other people or certainly to, really very little attachment. He's kind of got a restless sort of energy and a need to keep moving.
What was his motivation for being a sperm donor? Cash, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, you can be paid in the same way that you're paid for donations of blood in the US. In Canada, the laws around this are different. Obviously, we're not paid for blood. You can be remunerated a certain amount for expenses, but I mean, maybe that's a subway ticket, I don't know, in Canada for sperm donation. So, which is interesting, because as a consequence, we don't have a lot of Canadian sperm. There's not a huge market of Canadian sperm, where there's a huge market in the US. It's you see advertisements calling for, young, healthy men on university campuses. And you commit to a certain, I don't even know what the word is, schedule, I guess, a certain amount. I'm not sure. He did it for money.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I wondered if you thought that he had any kind of altruistic.
No, I don't think he has any. I don't think he has an altruistic bone in him. But he did feel like it was kind of, he's like, I could get paid to. I've wasted plenty of this in my life, and
Right.
I mean, he's not really invested in where it goes beyond that, and who makes use of it, and what might result.
Well, I know you're going to read a passage about Adam, but just to take this back to something you'd said before about how the law around this is changing so quickly, and I think the question you asked was, do we want to invite the law into these intimate personal situations? But I think that if the law is being invited, then it's probably being invited in the main by the now grown children of the people who were, well, the women who had these children, and the anonymous men who were the sperm donors. Because I mean, that was done, apart from the cash, it was, I think mostly it was done on the assurance of anonymity, and there will be no future repercussions, and nobody would be involved would have financial liability, for instance, for the children. But of course, this is now being questioned, and people, and
Sure, it's changing, yeah.
Yeah, it's changing, yeah, and which was easily foreseeable, and if it's changing, then it's changing at the behest of the children who want to know something about their roots. I mean, that's a fascinating thing.
Well, yeah, there's a question about, you know, is it a basic human right to kind of know your ancestry, your genetic history? And there's a strong argument to say, yes, it is a human right. And so there are certain countries who've changed their legislation around this. Canada and the US are behind, I think, what's happening in Europe, for instance, around this.
Well, which may explain to some extent if there's a paucity of sperm out there.
True, yeah.
Probably thinking twice before they sign up as donors.
But what's happening elsewhere in the world, because, you know, I don't want to say sperm supplies have dried up, but I'm saying it, you know, where there's less sort of less volume, people are going to the US. You know, it can be FedExed anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, and so, yeah, the US seems to be the primary supplier, let's put it that way, because there still is anonymity, there still is a healthy supply. However, during the pandemic, some of that got interrupted, and I did a little bit of research into what people were doing during the pandemic.
Well,
there were some very interesting, you know, it's become so sort of medicalized, and sometimes it's just an access issue, right? It's not that there's a fertility issue per se, or you know, certainly in the case of two women, it's a need for, you need the supply. And so there are these Facebook groups that really mushroomed during COVID, where donors would be willing to meet you in a parking lot and hand over
a vial.
And that I've seen positive and negative stories as a consequence, but it kind of cuts out the kind of the machine that, I mean, this is big business. It's huge business. It's like a $5 billion industry. And so, I mean, I don't want to advocate either way, but I can see how being creative in a situation like this may well kind of have longer term impacts in terms of how this is monitored, the law around it, etc.
This may be, well, I don't, again, yeah, this was your situation. You had your child through a donor. You've spoken very publicly about that and written about it. But did you like have a catalog? Was it, I mean, there's a whole bunch of people to choose from, and
you can,
yeah.
You can do that. I mean, I don't really want to get into the specifics.
Well, no.
But you can learn quite a lot of information about a prospective donor. Certainly, you know, probably more than, certainly health-wise, although it is reliant upon kind of the donor's recollection or reporting of their parents' health histories and their grandparents' health histories. There's no, how can we ascertain whether this is actually factually accurate? And there have been some cases recently where there are some Canadian families involved in this lawsuit with a corporation, one of the biggest facilities in the US, around false representation of a donor who lied, who said he had PhD in chemistry and turned out to be a convicted felon with claimed to have an IQ of over 140. Why you really would even want to invite that into your body, I don't know. But there's a tipping point. But convicted felon who'd never graduated from high school, and of course, you can sell sperm on the basis of he was a very popular donor,
Right.
For obvious reasons. I mean, people are compelled by, in particular, I think, education, photographs, yeah. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this, Bill, but there's a lot here.
Yeah. It is a complicated business, and it's one of the ways that our new families are being built, and it's an interesting complication that's been introduced into their creation, and then into their maintenance and into their future.
But I think we had talked also about the fact that there's a generation of and you just mentioned this, there's a generation of young people, right, who have grown up with full awareness that they were conceived through with the assistance of donor sperm. And now that we have kind of publicly accessible sort of DNA technology and DNA testing, it's much easier and much more difficult to preserve anonymity, and much easier to sort of discover relatedness, at least in a genetic sense,
right,
through these websites. And that's a whole, I think, I didn't write from the perspectives of the children because I don't feel I can. Partly, I mean, it's not that I can't imagine my way in, but it's also the fact that I do have a child who will have her own questions, and I don't even want to begin to imagine what those questions are for her. I want her to be the kind of the writer of her own narrative. I don't want to even, I mean, of course I can anticipate and arm myself, and have the information that she may want. But I don't want to attempt to tell the story from her perspective. I want her to tell me, or to her, if she chooses, This is, so I focused on the parents who were, I think the repercussions fewer for the parents themselves. In some ways, I think that's true. It's a means to an end, isn't it?
Yes.
For the parents.
Yeah. I just saw, excuse me, Camilla, I just saw Ara flash up there.
Popped up, flashed. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Look at you, looking fabulous as always, and always with the great glasses. Oh man, so nice to see you after all this time.
You too. Yeah, I'm coming to help with the Q&A portions.
Great.
Are there any cues?
I don't see any yet.
I'm not sure if there are any. So are we going just until 7? Is that?
Well, yes.
Yes. Okay. So we have another 10 minutes. So Camilla was going to do another reading. Do you want to do that now, Camilla?
Sure. I'll do a quickie.
This is Adam, right?
This is Adam. Yes. Adam, after he's been kidnapped and been moved from one location to a second location. When he wakes, he feels the coolness of concrete beneath him. The sun is rising, the view from inside the sack over his head mutating from black to brown to rust. He fingers the edge of the burlap at his chest, realizing he can lift it. He keeps his eyes closed against the sudden assault of light as he pulls the sack off his head and manages to push himself up into a sitting position. "My friend," says a voice to his left. The slightest turn of his head makes him nauseous. He squints against the light bouncing off the walls. There's a small window behind thick plaster lattice about 10 feet from the ground. In the opposite corner of the room, a man sits cross-legged, his hair and beard such light gray that they are almost white, his folded limbs long and pale like those of a praying mantis. Where are we? Adam manages, his voice a hoarse whisper. Sometimes I can smell the sea, says the man. My grandfather was a whaler. My father was in the oil industry, worked offshore. The sea has given the Norwegians everything. So the fact that I smell the sea might not even mean anything except that I'm Norwegian. Adam is exhausted by so many words. You've got malaria, the man says. You're the color of piss. Jaundice, of course. His hand rises to touch his face. How long have you been here? He asks. 336 days, says the man, trilling his R's. 300 and something days in a year. Adam cannot, in this moment, remember the exact number. When did they capture you, Adam? Hearing his real name brings his heart into his throat. It's Daniel. It's Daniel. My name is Daniel. Sorry, you told me Adam when I asked last night. Adam points a finger to his temple. His brain is obviously messed up. The Norwegian nods. I was sick for weeks. He leans forward and picks up a flip-flop, then whacks it against the concrete. He tweezes something from the floor with his thumb and forefinger. He walks over to Adam's corner with a flat brown thing in his hand and he says, I'm convinced this is what cured me. Adam looks into the man's palm, a squashed cockroach. Think about it, the Norwegian says. They live in the dirtiest places on earth. They must have some kind of immunity to the usual bacteria and parasites. He pops the thing into his mouth, crunches it between his molars and grimaces as he swallows. It's not so bad if you wash it down with tea. They bring tea 4 times a day, he says, nodding at the door frame. There is no door. There's a hallway painted bubblegum pink. Adam can smell incense burning somewhere, hear voices, male. Who are they? He asks. Children with AK-47s and some fantasy of virgins in the afterlife. Do you know what they want? $1 million, he says with a small mocking laugh. He becomes more subdued then. I rather suspect my currency has just been devalued. Adam shakes his head, not understanding. Euro or krona? Which do they use in Norway? An American has to be worth more to them. Adam isn't clear-headed enough to conduct a realistic assessment of the Norwegian. Is that bitterness or resignation in his voice? Is it all Americans he resents or just present company? A boy named Abdi comes to deliver tea. Do you take sugar? The Norwegian asks Adam. The improbable civility of the moment allows Adam to imagine briefly that they are simply fellow expats, sharing a pleasant exchange on the balcony of a small hotel in the Red Sea. Abdi, their waiter, hovering nearby for a tip. The Norwegian reaches again for his flip-flop and brings it with a whack to the floor. He hands Adam a little amuse-bouche to wash down with his tea. I think that's all I'll read just because I'm mindful of the time.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. Beautiful. We actually do have until 7:30. We can go as long as that. As it turns out, so but that's great. We can talk some more. I should just say that yeah. So if anyone who's with us has some questions for Camilla Gibb, then by all means avail yourself of the Q&A function that is there at the bottom of your screen.
I'm checking.
How many hours have we all spent on Zoom in this last while? I still don't quite get how it works. I just know that I look owlier and owlier. Anyway, thanks. That was beautiful. Yeah, I was thinking about Adam, and he's a person of interest. He has the possibility of ransom attached to him. He's kidnapped by this unnamed group of I don't know, radicals. I don't know how you would name them.
I think they're Al-Shabaab.
Al-Shabaab, yeah, okay. Anyway, when we were talking before about this kind of interstitial area that he seems to inhabit, where he's sort of an aid worker and sort of not, he's sort of intelligence, he's a little bit aid worker, he's a little bit CIA, he's a little bit something else. But I wondered if, because I think more or less at the same time you were writing The Relatives, you were making a radio piece as well about your mom.
Yeah,
and,
true.
and about her work with MI5, about which she has never been able to speak because of the Secrecy Act. I wonder if maybe some of that kind of slipped through, do you think?
How interesting. I can't sort of parse the exact timing, but it's always been there for me and my brother. My mom would kind of play it up, right? Because she did work for MI5 in the mid to late 1960s in London, and also was stationed in Trinidad for 2 years. And she would never tell us what she was doing, you know, and of course it just fueled fantasies for us that she was like, and she was extraordinarily beautiful, you know, and it just fueled these fantasies that she'd been this kind of fabulous operative. And she used to like, she would humor us. She would take a combination. I remember her doing this. I don't know if it happened more than once, but she took a combination lock and started and put it to her ear, and we thought, okay, she's a code breaker. She's, you know, she has all these, what other spy skills does she have? How did she learn her spy skills? And she was like, I cannot speak of it. I signed the Official Secrets Act. And we honestly, I wasn't sure if that was still true, like 60 years later. But my mom's a very moral and loyal person. And so she's now in her 80s. And this was a question I had talked about with a producer at CBC who was quite intrigued. And I was like, I wonder if I can get her to crack. Like, it's now or never, you know? So, and she agreed to talk to me, but she kept dancing around it. And so I had to get I read a fascinating sort of history of MI5, and then I got in touch with a guy named Calder Walton who'd written a lot of the history of MI5. And I got to interview him and ask him, well, what could she have possibly been doing in Trinidad in this particular, you know, during these years? And I spoke to friends of hers from Trinidad, saying, were you aware of what she was up to? And, you know, I tried to get at it from many different angles. And I still have no answer. I have a kind of an understanding of what MI5 was doing at the time, which was, I think they were keeping an eye on British Guyana, which I've slightly forgotten the politics, but they were concerned about a socialist leaning prime minister who had come to power after independence. But how much my mother was actually involved, or whether she was just, you know, typing secret correspondence, because having been recruited, you know, having been in a typing pool earlier in her career.
I imagine him going to his locker at the gym and saying, somebody's opened my lock. There's some clever operative opening the lock on my locker. Oh dear. Well,
but it's very funny. I even have my daughter sort of probing her, like, is it true you were a spy? You know.
Well, in a way, of course, you want her to stick to her guns, because to have this kind of allure attached to you, apart from anything
this
else,
mystique, right?
Mystique,
and
yeah.
it all works, and it and if it's too pedestrian, it'll be disappointing for us all. You know, if the truth is too pedestrian.
Did you have fun making radio? You made a piece about your father as well.
I did. Yeah, I really I made the piece about my father first, which was much more, you know, it was a painful piece, but I'm really, really so glad that I did it. But the experience of working in radio was, I knew, you know, I learned so much about, you know, writing for a very different medium, and writing a script and what was required of a script. I worked very closely with several people at the Doc Project who really mentored me. They were wonderful. And then we did the second one and had a little more play, you know,
Uh-huh.
and fun with it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, there you go.
But you know, who else's life? I've done now both my parents. So, you know, written a memoir. There's no one left.
Something else will come along. But don't you think this is the thing about the business that you're in, is that you may go through a period when you're just thinking, I have nothing left to say, but then all of a sudden you realize that in fact you do. That there's, the well actually doesn't go dry. Maybe it will eventually, but there's just so much there. There's just so much that needs saying. So.
There is, but I've been asking a lot of questions about, you know, and certainly in terms of my own work, you know, just about communication and expression. And I've been doing a lot more visual.
You make collages, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I wouldn't call it art. It's probably craft. But there are some things that, you know, there's some things you want to speak to that are just so huge and you don't know how to find a way in that isn't cliched, you know, like the our relationship to the environment, where I can play with imagery and say something without having to put cliched words to it somehow. I find that I find that very satisfying, I think, as a mode of expression. Mm-hmm. For the time being.
Can I ask you about, I think in This Is Happy, you write about how in your family there was no religion, that your parents were actively anti-clerical. Mm-hmm. You were raised without religion. But in Sweetness in the Belly, you write about Lily, who is a Muslim convert. Again, there are religious themes that come up in the relatives. Just the naming of Adam, for one thing, or the naming the lawyer whose name is Solomon, the lawyer who Tess goes to consult when this question of the ownership of these frozen embryos comes up. I mean, again, perfectly named. Solomon has to make the decision about the baby. But as somebody who was raised without religion, but whose work shows a kind of preoccupation with it, how is that, do you think? Is that purely?
I think it's rooted in some kind of spiritual envy, to be honest. You know, what I found problematic about not being raised with religion, or maybe with a tradition, a religious tradition, more specifically, is that, you know, it provides kind of rules for living in groups. Mm-hmm. And it provides a sort of common orientation around which community can be established, but it also, you know, gives you something to rebel against when you need to, and to figure out your own relationship to as you get older. But I felt that without that space in me having been cultivated in me as a child, that I was missing it. And so there was a kind of desire to, I cannot, for, how to put it? There was some desire to understand what it feels like to possess faith that I don't possess, you know, and the closest I can come to it probably was through many years of study, I guess, and through a character like Lily, who is devout. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Bill, but it
wasn't so much a question as it was an
observation.
Yeah. But well,
there was such a kind of actively hostile, and particularly on my father's part, kind of really hostile disregard for people who were believers of any sort. And I don't know how much of that had to do with his own upbringing, but I do remember him saying, because I said, well, I was very young when I asked this. I said, well, why do other people believe in this? Why do other people believe in this? And he said, because humans are weak. And the kind of the presumption there was somehow that we weren't, that we were strong, which I didn't feel and have never felt, so it was like, well, why is this avenue closed as a kind of, if we are weak, why is this closed? Even as an arena for exploration. There was contempt on his part. And I've never felt contempt. I felt nothing but envy, in a sense, and desire. But not, it's not something I can make happen.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. I can't believe in, I don't seem to have the capacity to believe in something higher, bigger.
How different were their families, your mother's family and your father's family? Your mother, very different?
Radically different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What were you thinking of?
Well, okay. I think it was in the, I always love the acknowledgements pages in books.
Oh yeah, it's where I go first.
I don't mean yours. I think it was in Sweetness in the Belly. One of the people you acknowledge is your grandfather, Sir Edward. He was knighted, right? Sir Edward Finnis.
Was knighted, yes.
Yeah, and you say, my thanks to my grandfather, Sir Edward Fennessy, for his concern. There's a story there, his concern. Now, I'm not asking you for the story, but I mean, he didn't exactly invent radar, but he was able to apply radar to the defense of...
He was among a small group of very young engineers. There were 6 of them who, were in the right place at the right time. I mean, not that the right time is a war, but they were recruited by somebody called ultimately Sir Watson Watt, but Watson Watt, to work on this idea of radar. And so this team, the 6 of them under his stewardship, under his guidance, put into place the first kind of working operational radar systems that were then employed in the war. With radar towers built all along the South Coast. And so my grandfather would tell me these stories that were a little lost on me because I wasn't really interested in wars and necessarily in history. But he was knighted and went on to have a very distinguished career. But, I'm sure you're well aware of kind of how classist England, especially, England at that time could be. And it was new money, which was really frowned upon. It had no roots, no history. He'd come from a poor Irish, working class family who had left Ireland and worked on the docks in East London. And he was just a clever boy who found his way.
Yeah. A difficult, a privileged situation to be in as well, an earned situation to be in, but in a society that classist, of course, very difficult because you're a parvenu.
That's right. Whereas my father's family had a kind of more distinguished, I guess, history, but they'd fallen in, upon hard times. And so there was no money and, but lots of investment in kind of family narratives of greatness. So it's a strange combination to bring together the new money, the daughter of the new money, and the son who's been raised on, yes, a diet of former greatness, but hasn't got a penny.
I don't know. Still, as a kid growing up, it would give you a certain claim to bragging rights. I think to have the mother who was the spy and the grandfather who invented her.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It's so interesting because they were both like, I don't know if it's partly cultural, right? They were both my mother wasn't just unknowable in the sense of, I didn't know what she did with MI5, just a little bit unknowable. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather was the same. And earlier you had asked a question about, whether there was any inspiration for Adam related to that. And I think I have asked the question with Adam, to what extent does he even know himself? He's not knowable to others, but to what extent does he even know himself? He doesn't want to know himself either. He has his own kind of complicated history with a father who killed himself when he was 6. And and he's sort of been running ever since.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself liking the characters equally, or did you wind up liking one more than another?
I had so much compassion for Adam, even though he's a difficult character. And I think I had an understanding for him. And I think understanding, it's not the same as liking, but I was invested in him. And I knew it was never going to end well. I'm not going to tell you the ending, but it wasn't going to end well with him and his partner, his girlfriend, Sophie. And then, yes, I really struggled with the lesbian couple, really struggled with Tess in particular, how to like this person who kind of, had to make choices that really hurt other people. And I wanted to understand somehow, I wanted to see if I could get my way into feeling compassion for her, and what her struggles might be, even though she wasn't able to really communicate them, at least in the context of the relationship. I found her difficult. But that's often the case that I find the characters who are, I don't think I'm like Tess, but this is a, she's probably the closest to my life in some sense. There's probably more the architecture of her life is probably closest to mine, and I find it sometimes more difficult to like the characters who are closer.
Mm. Well, she's an anthropologist essentially, and she's working on. Is that right? She's an academic.
She's kind of an urban geographer, and she's an academic, and she's working on a project called Geographies of Isolation. Looking at communities that have existed in isolation.
Very apt for this.
Yeah, it is actually.
There's,
it's so interesting when you begin to talk about it. I feel self-conscious talking about it because not all of these things are conscious choices, right? There's so many decisions you make in the writing of a book that are not conscious, and then to become aware of them, you start to feel a bit deliberate, a bit too deliberate.
Sure, I understand. Yeah, I did think that Geographies of Isolation would have also made a great title for the book. You know what I mean? It pretty much describes what all the characters are going through in their locked rooms of one kind or another. Lila is in her dead mother's apartment, drinking herself into oblivion, and locked in his cell, and Tess is sort of locked to her sense of, I don't know, ownership of these embryos.
Yeah.
The most uncomfortable moment for me in the novel was reading Tess and one of her interviews with the lawyer Solomon, who's very wise, and he's a great character. I don't want to say minor character. There are no minor characters, but he occupies less space in the book. But he's pretty great. I love Solomon, and he has to say to her in a way that's professional and yet caring. Well, again, here I'm paraphrasing crudely, but he has to say to her more or less, it is possible that actually you're just being an asshole.
I don't remember what it is he says exactly to her, but he also, as a lawyer, I find it interesting because, he's had his own kind of disastrous kind of first family. And he's been quite possibly an asshole in that context. He also has to say to her, is it really worth it? This can do more harm than good. And the law can be a really blunt instrument. And, he's sort of in some ways advising her against pursuing it.
Yeah. Well, the thing about being an asshole, everybody's an asshole at one time or another in their lives. The question is, do you actually learn from being an asshole?
Yeah, and he works in the realm of family law, which I think is, from what I've heard, is, and what I imagine is, you are probably witness to some of the most kind of painful and grotesque expressions of being human
Yeah,
in that context.
no doubt.
Yeah.
Camilla, I think I'm looking at the questions here. We should probably get to them now. And from Catherine Arnott. Can you see these as well?
I just called it up, yes.
Okay, so I'm intrigued by the fact that you like Adam the most. Is it because he's the one who's most different from you, or is there another reason?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Catherine. I think the sort of the corollary of not liking the ones that are closest to me probably is the flip side is having more distance allows me perhaps to have more empathy for a character. I also found him the most fun to write, though. So it was partly about process as well. Like I really had fun writing that. And he, I introduced you to Oscar in the passage that I read, and he's a creepy cat. And
Very much so.
and I really had fun kind of exploring that. And I really had fun exploring later when he returns to the US and he's in therapy, kind of questions about how much is Oscar a kind of projection of something on his part? Is Oscar real? I sometimes ask readers that question. Do you think he's real? And I get answers that are kind of, that are both black and white, but also somewhere in the middle, grayer answers.
Right. Well, it's the question that his, wait for it, therapist asked him.
Do you think he's, stop, Bill. Do you think he's real? Oscar?
Do I think he's real?
I mean, for Adam. I mean, not for Adam. Is he real? In the book?
I took him to be that, but then no one's ever going to crown me the king of abstraction. So yeah, and I'm a very literal person, and so I supposed him to be. I kind of wanted to be. Oscar is very interesting, and there are so few Norwegians in Canadian literature.
They're so underrepresented.
They are.
The Norwegians.
More lutefisk. Come on, bring it on. Okay, so I see Lynn Bennett's question here. I'll come back to that, and I'll jump down to Gail Atwill's. Have you ever thought about writing a historical fiction about your mother at MI5?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I guess it has crossed my mind. I felt maybe I wanted to do it more as it's terrain that feels like really, really well known in a way. I mean, yes, you can't get certain answers, but there's so much literature around spies and British spies. And I feel like the kind of education I would need, not just in terms of the history, but in terms of the reading everything that had been written, in the genre, is a little overwhelming to me. And I tend to, I think I like contemporary history more, sort of living histories. I say living histories because when I wrote Sweetness in the Belly, I didn't think of the 1970s and 80s in Ethiopia and London as historical. But then a much younger person who was involved in the filming of it very much saw it as historical. So, it's all relative, what I view as historical as opposed to somebody 20 years younger than me. And I think because so much of the interest in my mother's secrecy was about, can I crack this? Can I crack her code? I liked engaging her. I really found it very satisfying, even though I didn't get an answer, to engage her in the conversation. And so if I were ever to do anything more with it, I would want to involve her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be another interesting optic on that would be to write it from the point of view of a child whose grandmother is known to have been a spy, and someone who's some clever child who's determined to trap her.
I feel like, did William Boyd write a book in recent memory about something similar, about a mother who proves to be not who this child thought she was?
Oh, I don't know. But
I think so.
It's all about deception. I'm going to come to Lynn's question. Just sorry, this is when I look over here. I'm just checking the time. I have to look at my phone. So Lynn, coming to your question, but just Camilla, because you mentioned it, the film version of Sweetness in the Belly stars Dakota Fanning, and it was shot in Ethiopia and in I think in Dublin, right? Dublin is a proxy for London, and
Yes,
yeah,
it was.
and it was it released last year? I'm sorry to say I haven't seen it, but I haven't seen
No,
it.
it was it was a bit of a
Pandemic release.
it was a pandemic. It was the year that didn't happen. Do you remember that year? Yeah, it happened in that year. So its theatrical release was canceled as a consequence, and it went straight to iTunes or.
Is it on a streaming service? Like, is it on Netflix?
It's on. I haven't kept track. So it certainly was. It kind of went from iTunes to another one to another one. I'm not sure where it is now.
Yeah.
And it's a fraction of the book. But this is as it has to be. You can't take a 400-page book and sort of have an expectation that you'll be able to portray every sort of thread, every subplot, every nuance. So it's a different piece of art, I suppose, in the book.
Right. It has its own DNA, as I remember Michael Ondaatje, the English patient.
Yeah, and I'm quite comfortable with that. I never felt that that it needed to. I wanted it to kind of honor the spirit, but that's a very broad notion.
All right. So there's a question from Jerry. Jerry, I'm sorry, I'm not clear on how to pronounce your last name, Jerry. I'll come to that, but just Lynn Bennett says. Writes, I follow your collage work on Instagram too, love them. What interplay do you find between your visual storytelling and your written storytelling?
Thank you for following them. I get a great deal out of I don't know, I think satisfaction out of doing them. The relationship seems to be, I think particularly in the last 2 years, both pandemic related and no doubt midlife and parenting related, less time and perhaps less desire to explore a problem to write my way through a problem. I've been sort of problem solving with existing images, if that makes sense. So I think the same questions that kind of inform both my written work and some of the visual work. The manifestation is totally different. I feel like I can play a lot more with collage. There's some play with absurdity and somebody once said to me, Camilla Gibb, your brain, because some of the juxtapositions are whacked. But there's something freeing about it. And because it's not something I'm practiced at or I have studied, I also find it sort of liberating in that sense. There's no expectation, that it should work, that it should be good, that it should be publishable too. Whereas I put that kind of pressure on myself, I think as a writer, I think we all do once we move from being unpublished to published, there's a kind of a pressure, I would say mostly of our own making, that everything should be polished. And I like the kind of unpolished nature of what I'm doing visually.
We've heard from Julie Leclerc, who says, you're right, William Boyd wrote Restless about a mother who worked for Secret Services during the war.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent.
And then
I'm seeing a related question, and Jerry's question seems to be related.
It's kind of you've kind of answered Jerry's question, I think, in what you just said. Do you want to read the question, Camilla?
Yes. I think you have 100 more excellent. I thank you for the compliment. I'm too shy to read that aloud, but thank you. I think you have 100 more excellent novels ahead. Do you have 1 or 2 or 5 partly started hiding in drawers already? Oh, do I? But some of them aren't good enough, right? I've written, I would say, 3 novels that I decided weren't good enough.
Wow.
I wrote a first novel, which is just an embarrassment when I was maybe 19. It's a total embarrassment. And I don't even think I had a computer at that point. So there is a hard copy of it somewhere that will never be, it shouldn't even appear as my juvenilia once I'm dead. And then Tess's story, Tess goes to Crete because she has a family connection in the relatives. And it ties in with this project of geographies of isolation. There's a former leper colony on an island called Spinalonga off the coast where she is staying. And that was a book I tried to write, that I tried and failed to write. It was about isolation and illness. It was about sending people into quarantine. And many people have done that very powerfully. And what I was doing was not sort of powerful. And it fell flat. The characters fell flat. But so I know people say, well, you can surely if you set the novel aside, it's not wasted, you might come back to it, or you might reuse the material. That's generally not true. I kind of feel like the books that I've written that I've kind of set aside are more like just going to the gym, getting ready for the next one. It's just I'm using the muscles until the book that I will successfully write, is kind of upon me. But in this case, there was a literal lifting of just an idea that had sort of sparked a book before. And there's another novel, and there's that I didn't think was good enough. And I think you have to be able to stand behind the work. Like, I'm not a great liar, maybe, and I'm not the most kind of keen promoter, but I think that's an illness of my generation in some ways. It's I think younger generations are much more comfortable, and I mean it's both been more expected of them in their careers, and they're just more comfortable with this aspect of engagement. So if I had to promote a book that I didn't believe in, I don't think that would be rewarding for anyone, if you know what I mean. So I have chosen to, at least with 2 of them, to set them aside and not take them further after years of work.
Yeah. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end of our time, and I want to thank everybody for sitting with us, and Jennifer Surge for sponsoring this and the Davies family. It's wonderful that there's this lecture that is named for Robertson Davies, whose close connection to Kingston, of course, very well known. And also to Karen and Mike for their sponsorship of me here. Thank you so much for that. And mostly to Camilla, of course. Can I ask you one last question? Okay. Every time I see you doing one of these presentations, you have something beautiful around your neck, and you do today as well. What's that thing you're wearing?
This is really, it's funny. It was a piece of very simple jewelry, but it's got these wooden things. It was in an airport somewhere in Mexico, in an airport years ago. But I love the colors so much.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks very much for the conversation, Bill. I really I appreciate you doing this. I know that you're going to interview Thompson as well, Thompson Highway.
Yes, yeah, for the Vancouver Festival. So.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Ara and Claire, thank you, and to everybody at the festival, and again to everybody who has been with us. A great pleasure, and
thank you.
All the best. I know we'll be hearing from you in one guise or another. And it's going to be a pleasure as always. So lots of love to you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, and you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, I'm just going to come on to quickly say, again, thank you so much to Camilla and to Bill for this. We do have a book draw, and I want to congratulate Liz Saville, who is a winner of a copy of Camilla's The Relatives. If you didn't win a book and you would like one, be sure to visit Novel Idea Bookstore here in Kingston or your local independent bookstore to pick up a copy. They are available now. And thank you so much for joining us at this event and at Kingston Writers Fest. We still do have 2 more days of the festival to come, so please check out the lineup and help us support these fantastic authors. And yeah, have a wonderful night.
Thank you.